Okay, can you hear me? Is that good? All right. Well, I'm very glad to be with you here. This almost didn't happen because of the weather toward the east. My flight was canceled and I had to be rebooked and bounced all the way over to Vancouver and then came back. But I made it. Glory to God. Very happy to be with you. So, today we're going to be talking about the sacrifice of Christ on the cross and how we should understand that in the light of the ancient understanding of sacrifice and how they viewed sacrifice, what it meant to them, as well as the writings of the church fathers and how they elucidate the same subject. So we'll start out by considering, first of all, how we view sacrifice. You know, we have certain terms, certain words that we use just sort of without thinking. And we have certain assumptions about what they mean. And sacrifice is one of these. So we're going to sort of carefully unpack how we use the word sacrifice today, just in our modern secular context. And then we're going to consider whether that is the same or different from how the ancient people of the Bible and the early church viewed sacrifice. And this is going to be our starting point. Then we'll progress through considering how ancient people viewed this ritual of sacrifice. We'll look at the Old Testament sacrifices, and then finally the sacrifice of Christ. So, saved by sacrifice. What is the cross all about? First, sacrifice, a modern idol of loss. So how do we view sacrifice today? Well, there are three sort of domains in which we use the word sacrifice. One is to refer to a ritual. Now, usually when we use that word, we're not referring to the ritual directly, but how do we think about rituals of sacrifice? And I'm not talking specifically about us as Christians, but just modern people today. I have a couple of cartoons here which illustrate that modern idea of sacrifice, and especially the feelings that it evokes. On one hand, we have this businessman dressed in strange garb, holding a dagger with a goat tied below a hideous-looking idol. And below, he's pressing his phone intercom button, and he says, "Please hold my calls for the next 15 minutes, Miss Amy." So what do we get from that? I mean, it sort of reflects that idea that for us, the idea of sacrificing an animal is sinister, right? That's the vibe that comes from this cartoon. And really, when we think about sacrificing animals today, it seems like something violent, something barbaric, aberrant. In America, there were immigrants from Caribbean islands, specifically Cuba, I think, who wanted to practice their rituals of sacrifice that were part of their religion that they had brought over from Africa. Their ancestors had brought over from Africa. It's the Orisha religion, where they still sacrifice like chickens. But when they tried to continue this practice in America, their municipal governments, their neighbors, all were up in arms and passed laws in order to forbid it, even though supposedly in America there's freedom to practice religion. But it's because we have this fear of the ritual of sacrifice on one hand as being something violent and scary. On the other hand, you see the man approaching the goat, and he's dressed in biblical garb, and underneath it says, "And the Lord said, I created the universe. What on earth makes you think I'll be impressed by a dead goat?" So on the other hand, we think like, how on earth could God care about killing an animal? Like, how is that supposed to please him? So it's really a perplexing practice. I'll say as Christians, we read the Old Testament and we sort of take for granted that God told people to do this in ancient times. But maybe we try not to think very hard about it because it's hard to make sense of it in our modern frame of mind. Okay, so ritual offerings. Now, more often we use the word sacrifice in the context of, in secular contexts. So we talk about the sacrifices of soldiers, the sacrifices that parents make, the sacrifices that saints make for God, the sacrifices of the martyrs, the sacrifices of heroes. And what we mean by this is noble renunciations, where they deny themselves something for the sake of some greater good. And does anyone recognize this photo? Yes? So, of course, here is Spock's noble renunciation, his sacrifice, where he, says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one or the few, and gives his life for the sake of his crew. So this is the idea of sacrifice as a noble renunciation. But we sort of the use of sacrifice as a word in secular contexts spans a continuum. So on one hand, we have these beautiful, noble renunciations, but on the other hand, sacrifices can be thought of as pernicious bargains. We have a couple more cartoons. First, the man at the desk, he tells his friend, to get where I am, I had to make a lot of sacrifices. I sacrificed Jerry's health, Susan's marriage, and Henry's dignity. So this is an ironic use of the term sacrifice, but we talk about how, sometimes people sacrifice others' well-being for the sake of their own good. This is sort of turning it upside down. Instead of denying themselves for the sake of others, they deny others for the sake of themselves. So sometimes that's what we mean by sacrifice. And then there's the man in the lounge chair. The sign says, "Good sacrifices and bad ones. Which are you making?" And this slovenly man says, "I sacrificed 2 days at work to stay home, drink beer, and watch football." So sometimes we even engage in sacrifices to our own detriment. You think about, sometimes you might say, like, so-and-so sacrificed his relationship with his children for the sake of his work. That's obviously not a good thing, right? But that's one way that we might use the word sacrifice. Okay, so on one hand we have those noble renunciations, on the other hand pernicious bargains, and in the middle there's just sort of a neutral, unmarked sense of loss that's associated with the word sacrifice. And this is especially reflected in certain other words which in ancient times had specific sacrificial meanings, which now just mean loss or violence. The biggest one is the word victim. We use the word victim all the time. And victim means someone who has suffered something at the hands of others. But it doesn't matter whether that person suffered it in a noble way or an ignoble way, whether they did it voluntarily for some greater good or involuntarily just by accident. That word victim applies to all of them. Might surprise you to learn that victim comes from Latin, and in the Latin it never had anything to do with people who suffered. In the Latin, it was a technical term for the animal offered in sacrifice. So an animal offered in sacrifice was called a victim in Latin, but it wasn't used to refer to people suffering in various ways like we do today. In fact, it wasn't until quite recently, historically speaking, like maybe 300 years ago, that the Latin word victim started to take on this other meaning, and that was actually part of the distortion of the idea of sacrifice, which we now deal with today. Another word is the word Holocaust. The word Holocaust, of course, evokes for us the historical suffering that was imposed upon the Jews and other people in Nazi concentration camps. And you can't hear the word Holocaust without thinking of that. Well, in Greek, the word Holocaust means a whole burnt offering. And so you have old-fashioned translations of the Bible, like the King James Version, which will speak about holocausts being offered by the people of Israel. Well, it had nothing to do with, work camps and horrible, ways of killing people. It had to do with a specific ritual, a whole burnt offering. But today that word has been sort of taken over because of this idea we have of sacrifice as involving violence, loss, and suffering. So all of these different senses, modern senses of the word sacrifice, revolve around those violent and negative connotations, and they evoke negative feelings in us. Think about it. Now, especially I think older generations, when they hear the word sacrifice, see it as a virtue and as an ideal. It's something to aspire to. However, if you could avoid it, wouldn't you want to avoid sacrifice? If you could. And that sort of betrays that hesitation, that negativity which is underneath it. I mean, a soldier's sacrifice is beautiful, but soldiers don't go into the army wanting to become a sacrifice. It's something to avoid if you can, but if you can't, to accept with dignity and then to be honored. So this, in our modern sense of the word sacrifice, it's something that we have hesitation and reservation about, and which might even be considered unvirtuous, something sort of questionable, something which may be thought of as a means of, like a thought that is a means of controlling other people. So I'm thinking particularly of an essay that I read by a feminist who said that the word sacrifice and the calls on women in particular to sacrifice could be seen as a way of controlling them, because it's this ethos of suffering and loss. And of course, all of that revolves around how we think about the word sacrifice. Now, in this light, now we'll come to a third area in which we use the word sacrifice, and this is specifically as Christians. We use the word sacrifice in a theological context to talk about what Christ did for us, and also to talk about many elements of the Christian life. And here we're following the New Testament, which describes, of course, the cross as a sacrifice, but also describes Christians giving their life for God as a sacrifice. It describes giving of your money and giving help to the poor as a sacrifice. Giving help to God's ministers is also described in those terms. Worship to God is described in those terms, especially the Eucharist. So this word sacrifice is a key element of Christian theology. But given this negativity that revolves around this term in modern culture, how does our theological use of the word sacrifice strike people? Like I said, as Christians, we take it for granted. We don't often think very deeply about it. But imagine someone who didn't grow up in a Christian context, hearing about Christ sacrificing himself for us, and about how Christians have to sacrifice in giving to the church and giving to the poor. That Christians have to sacrifice for God through obedience, through fasting, through prayer. And how every week, or many times a week, Christians offer sacrifices to God. If you don't have that sort of assumed familiarity with the term, it sounds a little bit perplexing and bizarre and off-putting. So the word sacrifice can be a problem for us today because of our modern understanding and our modern feelings towards sacrifice. However, it's maybe not as much of a problem as we think. When we look at the Old Testament in particular and how sacrifices are described there, we find that this modern negativity is absent from the ancient thinking about sacrifice. So, these are quotes from the Psalms. First, from Psalm 26. And now, behold, the Lord has lifted my head above my enemies. I went around and sacrificed in his tabernacle a sacrifice of shouting. I will sing and play the harp for the Lord. A sacrifice of shouting. How do we sacrifice shouting? It's obviously a joyful experience. An experience of boasting. Second, from Psalm 53. I will willingly sacrifice to you. I will praise your name, O Lord, because it is good. Willingly sacrifice. This is something that really, when you think about it, most people today aren't willing to sacrifice, but in ancient times, people were willing to sacrifice. It was something that they sought out. Finally, from Psalm 106. Let them praise the Lord for his mercies and his wonderful works for the sons of men. And let them sacrifice to him a sacrifice of praise. And let them proclaim his works with great joy. Again, this sense of joy. When we read, especially the historical books, the book of Genesis and following that, we see many examples of people sort of spontaneously sacrificing as an act of gratitude towards God. And in Genesis, they built altars. You know, something good happens and you build an altar so that you can offer a sacrifice to God. Now, here is sort of the strangest and most bizarre reference to sacrifice in the Old Testament, and really prompts us to reconsider how we view this ritual. This is the sacrifice of the adulteress, or the adulteress's sacrifice in Proverbs 7. So in Proverbs 7, young men are given a warning about the dangers of the adulteress. And in that context, Solomon says that when the adulteress comes, she takes hold of the young man. Taking hold of him, she kisses him. And with shameless face, she speaks to him. I have a sacrifice of peace. Today I am repaying my vows. For this reason I came out to meet you, desiring your face, I found you. This is sacrifice as a pickup line. Can you imagine, from the modern perspective, it's completely bizarre that that an adulteress would try to lure a young man into her bed with invitations to sacrifice. Please come sacrifice with me. What is this all about? Well, in order to understand this, we'll jump ahead just a little bit. We'll talk in more detail about the context of what I'm about to tell you. But in ancient times, sacrifices were often occasions for parties, for celebrations, for feasting, where the food that was offered, so the animals offered along with other foods, part of it was given to God by being burnt on an altar, and the rest of it was returned to the worshipers, and they cooked it, and they ate it, and they celebrated together, and they had wine. And here this woman has taken something good, which is sacrifice, but she's focusing simply on the party element. And for her, inviting this young man to come and participate in her sacrifice was really an invitation for him to come and eat, drink, and be merry, with an implication of something further. Along the same lines, but from an extra-biblical source, in Plato's book, The Laws, he expresses concern about young people sacrificing too much and the dangers that this might lead to. This is a quote from The Laws. "Naturally, fear came upon me as I contemplated what one is to do for such a city as Athens, where young men and women are well fed, yet free from heavy and menial labors, which best quench willfulness, and where sacrifices, feasts, and dances are everyone's main concern throughout their lives. How in this city will they possibly abstain from the desires that too often cast many to the lowest depths, especially sexual desires?" So Plato expresses concern that the lifestyle of leisure in Athens allows too much time for sacrifices. Why? Because sacrifices are intimately tied to feasts and dances. So here again we see that in the ancient world, not only in the ancient Jewish world, but in the surrounding cultures, sacrifice was intimately connected with joy. It was something that people wanted to do, even sinful people like the adulteress. Whereas today it's something we want to avoid, if possible, if we're honest with ourselves. In ancient times, it was something that was joyful and desirable. So what was sacrifice to ancient people? What are we actually talking about when it comes to ancient sacrifices? And how is this different from today's idea of sacrifice? Well, in the ancient world, in the Bible especially, sacrifice was almost always a ritual rather than a descriptive metaphor. Today, it's usually a descriptive metaphor. When we use the word, we're using it as a descriptive metaphor. In the ancient world, people use that word mainly to refer to a ritual which was a very common experience. Sacrifices were happening in Jerusalem, for example, every day, many times a day. Like really probably constantly they were happening during the waking hours of the day. Outside of the kingdom of Israel, they were happening all over the place. In cities, in villages, in towns, in the countryside, in people's homes. It was a very, very common experience. What this ritual involved was offerings of meat, wine, oil, and other foodstuffs, which were either burned or poured out on an altar or displayed on a table in the presence of a god. So usually it involved burning, and so that's what the altar of burnt offerings was for in the tabernacle and the temple complex. So that's where the food offerings were burnt and the smoke went up to God, and that was a way to sort of symbolically transfer those gifts to God. The other method of sacrifice, displaying them on a table before the god, that was seen in Greek cultures and Babylonian sacrifice was mainly in this form, that there would be sort of the idol stood up and then a plate in front of the idol, and you'd have dishes of food that were displayed there and then later taken away and eaten by the priests. But there was this sort of ritual of setting out a meal before the idol, and that was the way in which they offered sacrifice. You can see something similar to that in the tabernacle and the temple with the table of showbread. If you're familiar with the rituals of the tabernacle and temple, there was a table inside of the tent, inside of the house of God, a golden table on which 12 loaves of bread were set out, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And those were exchanged every so often and eaten by the priests, and the new loaves of bread were set out. So that's the second method of sacrifice through display. So another element of ancient sacrifice was that it was often consumed by the worshipers, as I mentioned with the previous slide, that a ritual sacrifice would be followed by a sacrificial meal in which the food was divided up amongst the priests and the worshipers. And so it was an occasion for feasting, central to all kinds of celebrations and holidays. In the ancient world, for example, poor people probably would only eat meat during times of public sacrifice, on public holidays, when sacrifices were offered by either the government or by the wealthy people of the city. And then the meat of those sacrifices was distributed to the populace. That might be the only time when poor people in the ancient world could eat meat, because they would receive it on those occasions. So it was obviously a really significant joy and pleasure for them. And when I say central to all kinds of celebrations and holidays, so weddings involved sacrifices, the birth of children was celebrated with sacrifices, oaths were administered with sacrifice, people sacrificed before going to war, they sacrificed after victories in war. Every occasion in the life of individuals as well as the life of a nation was marked by sacrificial offerings. For us, sacrifice is connected with violence. And I'll say a few words for why that is the case. So, as I mentioned, these sacrificial rituals were common throughout the ancient world and happening every day, many times a day, in all of these nations. And this was true up until the triumph of Christianity. And with the triumph of Christianity, sacrifice, these sacrificial rituals, as I'm describing them here, these offerings that were either burned or displayed, were sort of wiped out of the Mediterranean world. First of all, before the triumph of Christianity, the Jewish temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, and that was the only place where Jews were allowed to offer sacrifices, so Jewish sacrifice came to an end at that time. But then in the 4th century, when St. Constantine, first of all, legalized Christianity, and then later, really within a matter of decades, his successor, Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius, St. Theodosius, outlawed paganism and pagan rituals. All of the other ritual sacrifices going on were ended at that time. So in the 4th century, they were outlawed, and they still continued to be practiced maybe for a couple hundred years as in like isolated pockets in the wilderness where the authorities couldn't impose their will. But by the year 600 or 700, this common ancient experience of ritual offerings of food was done away with. Now, we still have a ritual offering of food as Christians, the Eucharist, the Divine Liturgy. However, without sort of a wider context of comparison with other forms of food offerings, it lost sort of the vividness of its meaning. And we sort of lost the sense that the Divine Liturgy was about making an offering to God in addition to receiving a gift from God. So our focus has sort of turned towards what we receive from God in Holy Communion, but missing sort of the idea of what we're giving to God before we receive His gifts. So ancient sacrifices disappeared from the Mediterranean world as a result of the triumph of Christianity, but then at the time of the Reformation, there were debates about whether the Eucharist should be considered a sacrifice or not between Protestants and Catholics. Catholics considered the Eucharist to be a sacrifice, whereas Protestants considered Christ's cross to be the only sacrifice. And because they were debating about sacrifice, they had to come up with a definition of the term sacrifice. And they defined it on the basis of their understanding of the cross, which, if you've done any study about, sort of medieval Christianity, it was very focused on the violence of the cross, the sufferings of Christ. Even today, in much Roman Catholic theology, the sufferings of the cross were seen as being the basis of our salvation. The violence was really emphasized. Did you see the movie The Passion of the Christ? Mel Gibson. So in that movie, just such an intense focus on the sufferings and violence of the cross, because that was seen as being central to Christ's sacrifice and to how it saved us. And that's where actually those debates and that redefinition, that's where we got our modern sense of sacrifice as being defined by suffering, loss, and violence. But this is a distortion. When we go back to especially the biblical descriptions of sacrifice, we see that they don't match this definition. And I'll highlight just 3 ways in which they don't match. First of all, the idea of sacrifice as violent really focuses on the killing of an animal. The killing of the animal in sacrifice is seen as being violent. But there were many sacrifices in which no animal was killed. Vegetal sacrifices, or sacrifices of non-animal goods, grain, baked goods. Like in Leviticus, it says that a sacrifice can consist of unleavened cakes or crackers. Oil was an important part of sacrifice. Wine was offered in sacrifice. And incense. Today we don't generally think of incense as being related to sacrifice. But in the ancient world, it was very much within that category of sacrifice. The word for sacrifice in Greek literally means to turn into smoke. And that verb, theo, is the root of themiama, which is the Greek word for incense, because incense obviously is turned into smoke. And incense in the tabernacle and temple was offered on an altar and an altar specifically in Greek is an implement for sacrifice. So sacrifice involved many non-animal offerings: grain, baked goods, oil, wine, and incense. Secondly, in animal sacrifice, the slaughter was not the focus of the ritual. There are many ways in which we see this reflected in sort of the ancient descriptions of sacrifice. First of all, in Leviticus, the ritual instructions in Leviticus, the description of the slaughter of the animal is very brief, not detailed. It's one of several preparatory steps. But the later steps after the killing of the animal are given much more attention within the Levitical instructions. They're described, the instructions given for the later steps, which we'll describe later on, are much more detailed, which shows us that greater attention was paid to those parts of the offering, which would be burning the food on the altar and splashing the blood, placing the blood on the altar as well. But the slaughter was a preparatory step before those more important steps. We also see this reflected in ancient Greek art, specifically pottery from ancient Greece that shows scenes of sacrifice. It hardly ever shows scenes of the animal being killed. Instead, sacrifice is represented with other moments of the ritual which were more representative or more significant, more symbolic of the ritual for ancient people. Finally, the animal's killing was not understood as an act of violence, but simply as a practicality. And this centers on what I was saying earlier about sacrifices being food offerings. If you're going to offer food, or if you're going to eat food, as the food was eaten by the offerers, killing the animal is a necessary step if you're going to eat meat. Now today we miss that in our modern urban setting. We sort of think that meat comes from supermarkets, right? But before the meat gets to a supermarket, an animal has to be killed. For many of us, especially if we're not sort of familiar with agriculture and farming, that can be sort of frightening thought. But really, it's not violence, it's practicality. So, given this difference in perspective between ancient people and us, you can sort of imagine us as Viceni, the bald man from The Princess Bride, who's constantly saying, "Inconceivable! Inconceivable! Inconceivable!" The ancient people are Inigo Montoya here, who says to Viceni at one point, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." So we have to rethink what the word sacrifice means in the Bible, in Christian theology, and in our practice of the Christian faith today. So that's the end of our first session. I'll take some questions maybe, and then we can either take a break now or take a break after the questions and start a little earlier on lecture 2, which is going to take, I think, more than an hour, or we can start lecture 2 and then take a break. But anyway, questions first, please. I really invite your questions because we're really trying to deconstruct our sort of assumed perspective on sacrifice and rethink it. So questions are good. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So we'll be covering the Old Testament sacrifices and the different varieties in Lecture 3. Yeah.
So it would be appropriate then in the parable of the prodigal son to say that when the order was given to kill the fatted calf, that was a sacrifice.
Actually, it was a sacrifice, but not in the modern sense.
Right.
Yeah, in the ancient sense. So when we hear that the animal is killed, we think, oh, it's dinner. And we don't automatically connect that to sacrifice. In the ancient world, especially outside of Israel, dinner was always connected to sacrifice. Because any meal began with an offering to the gods. Any meat that was eaten had to be offered sacrificially to the gods, and then the remaining meat was cooked and prepared and eaten. So it was necessarily connected to sacrifice for ancient people. In Israel, it was a little bit different. I don't know how much time we have to go into it, but because they had only one site for sacrifice, the Jerusalem temple, people who lived far away from that obviously couldn't practically go there every time they were going to have meat for dinner and offer the sacrifice, offer the animal as a sacrifice first. So that was a little bit of an exception in the ancient world, but for ancient people, sacrifice and dinner were necessarily connected. And there is actually a hymn from the Sunday of the Prodigal Son, which refers to the God as the Father in the parable, offering Christ as a sacrifice in the form of that calf, that fatted calf. That it is a sacrifice. But a sacrifice in the sense of sharing sustenance. Yeah.
Just a question about, we sometimes use the word oblation.
Yeah.
Now, and sometimes in the context of the table of oblation, is there a difference between, do you have some insights into the nature of that word, and is it different?
Yeah, it's an old-fashioned Latinate word for offering.
Okay.
It just means offering, like prosphora in Greek. Prosphoron is translated oblation. Yeah, so really it just means an offering presented to God. Yeah, which is central to the idea of sacrifice. It's definitely related.
How about the memorial Easter when we offer the kolache and the leva? Is that considered a sacrifice?
It would be from an ancient perspective. An ancient person seeing that ritual, even though we don't use the word, they would definitely perceive that just naturally as being a sacrificial act. And that for us converts, we lose touch with cultural manifestations of orthodoxy, many of which have this same flavor of sacrifice. So I was talking to a friend of mine from Bulgaria who said that when something good happened for people, they would cook some food, like cook a fish or something like that, take it to the church, and the priest would say a prayer, and then they'd divide up the food between the priest and them and go have dinner. It's exactly what an ancient sacrifice was. Yeah.
So one of my sticking points a year ago coming to Christianity was about sacrifice, because it seemed so barbaric all through I'm trying to figure out how Christ's sacrifice wasn't. Are you getting to that later?
So that will be lecture 4, yeah. Yeah, we'll be building to that point. Yeah, so, and I will encourage everyone. It's so hard. We have sort of an ingrained, assumed understanding of what sacrifice is. It is going to be a little bit hard to pry our minds away from those assumptions to see it from a new perspective, but it will be worth it if you can just sort of bear with me and try our hardest to squint and see where we're going.
Father,
And ask questions as well.
as you hear the questions, for the sake of those listeners at home afterwards, could you summarize what the question is?
Certainly.
Father, then how, in light of what you're saying, would we rethink the Tridentine assertion of Christ being the spotless victim in response to the Reformers?
Okay, the question was, how would we, okay, say it again.
How
would we rework the Tridentine Roman Catholic understanding of
the spotless victim.
Christ as the spotless victim?
Yeah.
Well, we would also agree that he was the spotless victim, but not victim in the modern sense. Victim in the ancient senses, he was the spotless or unblemished offering to God in the sense of sacrifice that we're going to be discussing in the next lecture. Yeah, so we would still use that terminology, but mean something completely different. And it's all based on that definition. So the Tridentine, we say Tridentine, it's the Council of Trent, which was the Roman Catholic response to the Reformation. So really, the Council of Trent is one of the places where that redefinition of the idea of sacrifice was happening, and where sacrifice was being defined very explicitly as necessitating violence or loss or suffering. In order for it to be a sacrifice, it had to have those things. But that was all happening in the context of those Reformation debates including Council of Trent.
You explained that the nature of the offering was kind of a pleasant or a party thing, but there was still a sense that it was an offering. And then St. Theodosius put an end to that, I assume because of the nature of the pleasure. And what then was St. Theodosius saying about the church's understanding of offering?
Okay, the history is obviously it's like 1,000 years of history in 2 minutes, which is a challenge. So what the question first of all was trying to understand a little better what this historical development was away from the ancient practices of sacrifice toward our modern Christian understanding of sacrifice, or modern Christian practices of worship. So I'll try to restate it a little more carefully. And it is also described in the book. So in the ancient world, there were all of these ritual offerings going on, where food offerings were being presented to either God by the Jews or the gods by pagans. But they all reflected the same. What do I want to say? They were all different versions of the same basic ritual, which was that food items were presented to a divine being, and part of the offering was burned, turned into smoke, so that it would symbolically ascend to God. And then the rest of it was returned and eaten as sort of a celebratory meal, and that's where that feasting comes from. When Christianity came along, and this is the part that I left out earlier, so I should have included this. When Christianity came along, there was this sense that Christ had offered a sacrifice to change all sacrifices. That his sacrifice was something new that fulfilled the potential of this common ritual, and at the same time changed it. And so Christians no longer participated in those common practices of sacrifice going on around them. This was, especially in regard to pagan sacrifice, this was seen as critical because Christians couldn't participate in offerings to false gods. And those pagan sacrifices were offerings to false gods. But in the internal context of Christian worship, there were still food offerings that were made, but there was an effort made to make them distinctive so that they wouldn't be confused with the offerings that were happening in the surrounding pagan cultures, so that they would be clearly connected to the gospel. And the chief sacrificial practice for ancient Christians was the offering of the Eucharist. But then also, metaphorically speaking, all of the different aspects of Christian life, worship, obedience to God, asceticism, taking care of the needy, giving to the church, were all described metaphorically as sacrificial practices. And the sort of ancient mentality of what that meant was attached in a certain way to those practices. And we're going to talk about that in a second, and maybe some of this will become more clear. What changed with St. Theodosius was that he declared that pagan sacrifice, the old rituals, had to stop. Because paganism had to stop. And Christianity would be the only legal religion under Theodosius, I think, with an allowance for Judaism, but paganism definitely had to stop. And so the new Christian version of sacrifice remained in the Eucharist and in those metaphorical descriptions of Christian practices as sacrifices. But the meaning of what they meant as sacrifices faded, as there was no wider context to compare them to. So it really wasn't that St. Theodosius had anything to say about what sacrifice meant. It's just that he ended paganism, and so there was no wider frame of reference to inform what these practices meant as sacrifices.
Did the pagan think of the offering as personal sacrifice?
Yes.
So then, how did...
So, the question was, did the pagan think of the personal offering as personal sacrifice? And I said yes.
How did the church respond to that?
How did the church respond to that? Well, first of all, that the pagans were making offerings to false gods that were not gods at all. And secondly, that these ritual forms were actually empty because their hearts were not in the right place. So they were just going through the motions. And that's something that we're going to get into more as we progress, but how sacrifice as a ritual, the ancient sacrifice as a ritual, missed its potential. Especially in terms of paganism, but also in terms of Judaism. It proved itself to be hollow and ineffective. And that's another reason why Christ reformed or renewed or fulfilled, is really the word that we use, the potential of ancient sacrifice. Yeah, so and these are great questions because I didn't go into all that detail earlier.
Do you think the modern form of Thanksgiving meal can be booked as a form of sacrifice?
Do I think that the Thanksgiving meal is comparable, like a modern form of sacrifice? It's very, very similar. And we'll get into, meals and sacrifices. The meaning of sacrifice is bound up with meals. As I said earlier, like dinner and sacrifice in the ancient world were indistinguishable. Other questions? All right, well, we have a break now for, do we really need a 30-minute break? Yeah?
You go on to sacrifice.
Okay. Father, we'll take a break now?